Recently, I've been getting back into playing narrative video games, since Laura's away at Disney again and I needed something to work on whenever I would burn out from my editing job. In the past month, I played 2 games in their entirety, both of which were the second and third installments of a trilogy I haven't really touched in a long time. The games were Prince of Persia: Warrior Within and Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones for the PS2. I would have also replayed The Sands of Time, which is the first installment of the trilogy, but yeah, believe me when I say I still remember it fondly though, so it will be included in this discussion. Plenty of people have reviewed these games to death when they first came out, but what I wanted to do is take a retrospective look at the trilogy as a whole and sort of use it as an opportunity to talk a little bit about thematic retconning. A retcon is a device in serialized storytelling that allows for writers to use new story points introduced in later installments of a franchise to fix issues in a previous installment. This can have to do with continuity and a whole variety of things, including plot points, character traits and choices, lore, and other such things.
But you can't be my father.
They took you away from me, but I made them pay.
I'm not of the opinion that retconning is inherently bad, and when done well, it can potentially even enhance a franchise's overall story by elevating its collective content. I think the Prince of Persia trilogy is an exceptional example of a great thematic retcon, and tone is a big piece of that success in retrospect.
I give you the sands of time. May the friendship between our kingdoms endure as long as time itself.
Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time was released in October of 2003, with its follow-up installments each coming out a year after one another. So that's 3 games in 3 years, the first of which was written by the IP's creator, Jordan Mechner. Mechner was hell-bent on being a screenwriter for Hollywood and used a lot of his knowledge of base narratives, characters, and goals on the first Prince game. The game was rated T. It was very tonally whimsical and fairy tale-like, and it settled on themes of friendship and trust in the face of deceit. I'm powering through this game quickly because it's the first. It has arguably the least to say about the trilogy as a whole, other than the fact that it sets the precedent of the series' tone, which also happens to be the core of its complications in retconning later on. The second Prince of Persia game, Warrior Within, will mostly be the center of my focus regarding the trilogy, and not because it's my favorite guilty pleasure game of the 3. As a matter of fact, this installment is where all of it went wrong at first. If you've never played these games before, I'd like for you to keep in mind how I've described the first game. We have optimistic, fairy tale-like, with an earnest depiction of the prince as a young naive person that eventually learns how to trust and truly personally transforms by the end. Happy ending.
Time is an ocean in a storm. You may wonder who I am and why I say this. Sit down, and I will tell you the tale like none that you have ever heard.
And then...
You bitch! Die, bastard!
What the fuck?
The beast, the Dahaka, is the guardian of the timeline. You were supposed to die, so it will catch you and see to it that you meet your fate.
This section is going to be very long because it's more or less a full review of Prince of Persia: Warrior Within on a story level. It's worth noting that the entire creative team for the second Prince of Persia game was completely changed, since the original team from the first game kind of left to make Assassin's Creed. This new team included new writers who indulged the idea of adhering to popular trends in video games at the time in order to sell more. The biggest of these trends was tone. So it got darker, and meaner, and more gratuitously violent, and... Technically, the plot of Warrior Within is a retcon because the conflict of this game is a direct result of the events of the previous one.
Something terrible happened when our army traveled to the Maharaja's palace.
You found the sands of time.
Worse, I opened them.
Whosoever shall open the sands must die.
This was done despite the fact that those threads in the first game were more or less tied up and treated like a real happy ending. Sequels and franchises tend to do this often, treating previous installments like a chapter rather than the solo story it was when it was first released.
A few years ago, I almost lost her, so I trashed all my suits. Then we had to mop up Hydra, and then Ultron. My fault. And then, I never stopped. Because the truth is, I don't want to stop.
The initial story of Warrior Within has great thematic potential and could have been the first of the series' great retcons. The idea that your actions have consequences is a useful one. It's simple and the tone and conflict match it. The game even starts strong with the notion that while the prince himself will definitely try and avoid the consequences of his actions, as the old man put it,
You cannot change your fate.
and as Kylina puts it,
I have known my whole life that what is written in the timeline cannot be changed.
and as Shadi puts it,
You cannot change your fate.
all the pieces are here to tell what is more or less a tragedy. If the theme is actions have consequences, then there's plenty of room for a story where, despite everything the prince does, he eventually fails. And that's mostly what happens. His goal is to stop the sands of time from being created, and he ends up being the one to create them himself. And thus he finally realizes,
What is written in the timeline cannot be changed.
that's a really powerful potential ending. It's not a happy one, but honestly the game was tonally going for darker, and if they had to, they should have thematically followed through. That could have been the prince's arc, learning to live with his demons. If the game had ended at its midpoint, that would have been a fantastic story, I think. But actions have consequences is not the theme of Warrior Within. The theme of the game is second chances, redemption, and the game puts a lot of work into trying to convince you that it's earned this theme with a whole lot of gameplay devices, most notably in the Mask of the Wraith, which physically allows for the prince to do the entire game over. It's a literal second chance. They're not always subtle with this stuff. In a way, the first game had a similar theme in its text as well, exemplified through the massive rewind at the end. The prince learned his lesson, so therefore he deserves a second chance, right? Except in Warrior Within, the prince learns nothing. Through violence and anger and persistence in his vengeful quest to be free of the consequences of his actions, he just gets what he wants. Because he really wanted it. The game even makes this worse by making two of its key moments based on randomly changing a fixed event by doing literally nothing different, and the prince deciding he doesn't want to kill Kylina because he got a sword. What?
We all make mistakes. Some are small, some are large. But his mistake, born of innocence, fueled by pride, was the greatest and most terrible of them all.
So I just spent a lot of time talking about Warrior Within's flaws because of what it retroactively does to the previous game and what it does to the potential series. The retcon undercuts the ending of the first game with a promising thematic idea in its conflict, but abandons that idea halfway through, making Warrior Within a bad retcon. It doesn't thematically justify its commercial change in tone, and it gives us very little in the way of story and character to justify the rest of it. This is a shame because I found a lot of the surface level gameplay devices and even some of the tonal stuff to be a really interesting new place to take the prince. There were just no solid ideas supporting any of it. I mean, it's still my favorite game though, but... So, now the franchise is a mess, right? First game is good if you ignore the sequel, and the second game is fun if you don't think about it too hard. Not much of a satisfying narrative experience. Until...
Would it kill you to show a little optimism?
Experience has taught me wishful thinking only leads to disappointment.
Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones hit in December of 2005 and should have been a complete disaster. It was not, and it's arguably the glue that binds this entire trilogy together. The writers of Warrior Within were now tasked with the seemingly impossible burden of crafting a good story that was also a satisfying cap to a very tonally aimless trilogy. Luckily, they not only reinstated the first game's fairy tale-like atmosphere and softened the edge that Warrior Within sharpened, they still maintained a lot of that edge and used it as the driving force of the game's and the trilogy's central theme. While the first two games did share a similar theme of redemption, even if it didn't functionally work in a lot of places, the production of The Two Thrones chose to right the wrong that Warrior Within committed by addressing one consistently ignored idea: consequences.
Father, forgive what I have done, wherever you are.
The Two Thrones places the prince back into Babylon, his home, where he realizes that all of his actions from both previous installments have drastically changed history and have ruined everything. His ignorance in the first game led to his selfishness in the second, which he is finally made to pay for in the third. This is a massive retcon of the entire story that decontextualizes the prince's every action and gives his character motivational clarity where there previously may have not been. The prince is now framed as a man that lost compassion in the 7 years between the first and second games due to the trauma of being chased by the Dahaka. He became arrogant, selfish, and ruthless, all of which were inherent aspects of the second game, but are finally made to be textual by the prince in The Two Thrones. He slowly gains his humanity back and is forced to reflect on who he became through the wonderful addition of the Dark Prince, who embodies the second game Prince's worst qualities in order to comment on how much he regressed as a character. This allows for the game to literally have two distinct tones at once, that of the Sands of Time and of Warrior Within simultaneously.
We are close, Prince, so close. Let us make him suffer.
I so badly wish that the Dark Prince was voiced by Robin Atkin Downes, who had voiced the Prince in the second game. That genuinely would have tightened this whole thing even more. By the conclusion of the Prince's arc, we are given a definitive moral answer to his actions. And all of those ideas I mentioned earlier, about the potential arc of the Prince in the second game being about learning to live with his demons, are finally used here.
You are right. I have been like a child. Naive and arrogant, always rushing to undo my mistakes, never facing the consequences of my actions. No more. I accept what I have done, and all that it implies.
What is this? You have no water? How did you...
You hold no power over me now. Begone! Retreat to whatever dark hole spawned you, and do not trouble me again.
The franchise was finally free of the biggest problems that the second game created. Now, does this retcon do a good job at making the second game retroactively better?
Everything you have done contradicts this. I have seen the way you hunger for combat. You take pleasure in creating death.
In context of the trilogy, Warrior Within now becomes a piece of a story instead of its own individual one. So while I'm playing it, I understand that this is the low point of this hero's journey rather than a journey he's expected to learn anything from just yet. This is the only way the game can be viewed if we want to see its narrative as a decent one, and therein lies the interesting thing about serialized storytelling in relation to a retcon. How we fundamentally experience the story changes completely because now the story is only improved by context provided later. Is that bad? Yes and no. I think this has the potential to make individual stories in a franchise lazy, because there's always the idea that even a massive error can be covered up with a well-placed detail in a later installment. Retconning as a result could become an editing tool rather than an enhancer for already great stories. So it's the duty of a series writer to ensure that such changes could only be the latter. As writers, we need to focus on writing sound individual stories first. Only then can the worlds we build beyond them become justified. The Prince of Persia trilogy is an overall great example of storytelling that fixes and repositions itself in order to succeed. Despite some mistakes and a very clear identity crisis at the narrative's midpoint, each game collectively complements one another by building off their ideas, good and bad. Continuity is difficult to maintain across games or movies or seasons of TV, and slip-ups do happen, so sometimes it's more practical to just right a wrong and to go on from there. Who knows? The whole story might even be better off for it.
Time is an ocean in a storm. You may wonder who I really am, and why I say this. Come, and I will tell you a tale like none you have ever heard.